Hello, Emily. Good to see you. Thank you for joining me.
Good to see you.
So I'm starting these conversations then with a kind of introduction really to get to know people. So I wonder if you could tell us what has been your journey into Quakers? How long ago was that? What were you seeking? And what did you find?
Well, I suppose I started looking for a faith tradition of my own when I was about 10 years old. And I was raised in a different tradition that really didn't feel like mine. And so, what I was looking for was somebody who would say that God talks to all people. That was really important to me. And this is not a very refined thought, but I was quite young. It was also important to me that they did not say, we know the truth and everyone else is going to hell. That was very important to me too. And so it took me about 17 years to find Quakers. I was 27 when I walked into my first friends meeting in New York City. And it was not actually the first week, but the second that I heard something that made me say, okay, I'm staying here. This is my group of people that says God talks to everyone. And then I just did. I stayed.
Great. So would you mind telling us a little bit more about that? Because what I'm really interested to know about before we get into talking about other things is a bit about, what has formed you? What has been your spiritual formation, religious formation? So I'm very interested in what you've said there as a 10-year-old. A 10-year-old is steeped in what, the church you were going to, perhaps. Can you say a bit more about that and be- because I suppose the reason I'm asking is that although we reject parts of those formational experience, we often keep parts of them as well. I wonder if
Oh,
you
yeah.
got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, there are things from the way that I was taught as a child that I value tremendously. A lot of it is, well, I'll go into that a bit more in a minute, but the moment that I can remember of saying there is something about this that doesn't feel right to me was when I was actually 6 years old. And what I remember, so it was my family was Mormon, and what I remember is that there are these things they teach children called the Articles of Faith, and you kind of get like a little prize if you memorize them, which I never did. Uh, but one of them says, "We believe the Bible to be the Word of God so far as it is translated correctly. We also believe the Book of Mormon to be the Word of God." And what I remember asking, I think I remember asking this of my dad. I said, why does it not say the Book of Mormon if it is translated correctly? And he said, well, because we know that God that it was translated correctly. I said, how do you know? And he said, well, because Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon, and we know that God was talking to him. And I said, how do you know God wasn't talking to those other people? And the thing that kind of struck me, even from the point of very young childhood, was not so much a theological problem as a logistics and systemic problem. It did not make any sense to me that God would talk to one guy, and that guy's job was to tell everybody else what God said, because that's a terrible communication strategy. Not everybody even knows that guy. This doesn't make any sense. And so I just knew that that couldn't possibly be right. And that was kind of what set me looking initially. But there are a lot of things from that childhood experience that I really value. And when I got older, when I was an adult, somebody asked me a question once that gave me a new perspective. The person asked me, what is the gift that you think the Mormon church brings to the world? And I don't know what prompted that person to ask me that question, but I knew the answer right away, which is that they know the answers to all the questions. And for some people, it is extraordinarily important on a faith journey to have answers to all the questions. Some people are wired that way and they really need that. And the church is a hugely positive force for people who connect with God in that way. But it's not how I'm wired. I'm wired for questions rather than answers.
Gosh, that's such a great story. I haven't met you before, so I suppose that's really quite an from a British perspective, that's really quite an unusual story. I mean, it perhaps isn't from where you're from, but that's so interesting, and I think we'll all be, friends listening to this will be struck by the wisdom of a child to be asking really difficult questions. We'll feel for your father in that. Um,
Yeah.
so tell me a bit about you said you took you 17 years to find Quakers. So what happened in that period?
Well, that was rough. My parents are amazing. They said to me that I never had to believe anything I didn't believe, and I never had to lie. But I was expected to go to all the church stuff with the family because that was what our family did. The line I remember is, "This is a matter of family unity."
Yeah.
And so I did go to all of the church stuff, all the way through childhood and teenagerhood. And because of the particular way that that tradition teaches people, there was a lot of sort of cultural, moral value stuff that's not actually necessarily the theology,
Mm.
but makes you very different from the rest of the world. Like when I graduated from high school and went to college, I was only 17. I had never seen a person drink alcohol in my life. I had never witnessed that. And I thought, I don't think I can go to a so-called ordinary university experience because I wouldn't know how to handle that. I would be terrified. So I didn't. I went to a Mormon college. I went to Brigham Young University. And then I graduated there and I was 20, and I still really wasn't functional in the wider world of other types of people. And there were various ways that that was the case. Some of it was morality code, some of it was social stuff. And again, I want to restate, my parents are amazing, and they did exactly what they thought they needed to do to protect me and raise me to be the best person I possibly could. But then it turned out that what I was actually going to need to be equipped for was a different kind of life than they had imagined for me. And so there was a lot of trying to very awkwardly kind of thrash about and looking for other faith traditions and visiting other kinds of churches and so forth. But I think the reason it took me so long to find Quakers is because we don't have a great public relations campaign. It's better now than it was then,
Mm.
but at the time, I genuinely thought that Quakers still wore bonnets and drove buggies. And this was not for lack of trying to research religions. I was reading all kinds of stuff, but we just didn't come up in the theological circles. I didn't see it. And so I didn't know.
Gosh. And of course, you're talking about the US context, but I'm sure people would say the same things in Britain as well. So tell me about how you did find Quakers then, and what was that journey like?
Well, somebody said to me, "Have you ever tried Quakers?" And I said, "No, they're weird." And the person said, "Well, actually, I don't think so. I think maybe that's not the case." And I went online, and at this time period, there was nothing like Quaker Speak or anything along those lines. But there was YouTube. YouTube existed then. And I actually found a YouTube video from Britain Yearly Meeting. I don't remember what it was. Uh, and I don't know that I could find it again. And the only thing I remember about it is some of the B-roll footage of people walking into a room and sitting down on benches and sitting in silence. And I thought, well, okay, that's a little odd, but I could do that. I could walk into a Quaker meeting in ordinary looking clothes and sit on a bench and not speak. I feel sure about my capacity to do that. So I thought, okay, I'll go and I'll visit. Um, there was a meeting in New York City where I was living that was actually much closer than the meeting I eventually went to, which is also in New York City, but was about an hour and 15 minutes by subway. And the reason I didn't go to the closer meeting was because their website said something like, we're in the tower of such and such church, and we're usually on the 12th floor, but sometimes we're on the 8th floor. So you need to ask the security guard when you walk in. And at that time period, I was so shy. I mean, so shy that I could not imagine myself having sufficient courage to ask the security guard what floor I was supposed to go to.
Mm,
I knew I couldn't do it.
mm.
And so I went instead to the meeting that had been in the same place for like 150, 200 years. And the time of their worship was literally carved in stone on the side of the building. And that's where I went.
That's that's funny. I mean, it's a lovely story, isn't it? It's a lovely story. Simply knowing where to go. Yeah.
Yeah.
It reminds me, these images that we put out for people. And if we just show one person on their own, it doesn't kind of show the fact that we, as you say, come into rooms together and sit down and be with other people. And yeah, that's great. So you turned up at this meeting, and what was that like? And you say that that wasn't so powerful as the second one. So tell us about that.
First meeting for worship that I went to was entirely silent. Nobody spoke for an hour. And I know now that for my home meeting, that's very unusual. But that just happened to be the case. And I sat there in silence for an hour, and then somebody stood up and made a string of announcements that was more than 20 minutes long. And I understood none of them. All of them were in language that was incomprehensible. And then they said, if you want to have snacks, they're down the hall. But again, the level of shy that I was at the time, there was no way in the world I could walk down that hallway and into a room of strangers and try to initiate a conversation with somebody. No way. And so I left. And I was actually really annoyed because I felt like, how am I supposed to have any idea whether the Quaker setting is the right place for me or not if they never talk? What I, and of course, again, I know now, like there are books and I could have asked questions and there are pamphlets, but my experience in that moment was that I did not know any of those things.
No.
But I did go back a second Sunday, which was honestly an act of desperation. I wanted a faith community so badly.
Mhm.
And I had looked in so many other places and had so many other experiences that just didn't work. And I thought, well, maybe if I go back again, something will happen that will make this make more sense. And I did, and it did. A friend in the meeting stood up and offered that old quote of there is that of God in everyone. And I know this friend very well now, and he doesn't even especially like the traditional interpretation of that quote. So I haven't the foggiest what he actually said about it on that day. I have no memory of that. It was just the quote that made me say, this is it. This is a group of people who believes that God talks to everybody. And I'm going to stick around and see what will happen next.
Mhm.
I actually
Okay.
think
Yeah.
that another valuable story is I was there for just a few weeks when I went to my first meeting for business because they said, we're going to have this meeting for business. Everyone is welcome. It starts at this time. It's in this room. Uh, I can only imagine I left the building during social hour and walked around the block a bunch of times because I know I didn't go to social hour. But I did go to the business meeting that started an hour later. And I sat along a wall and we were in a small room. It's not the same room where we worship. And so there were like 35 people in a room, very tightly pressed together. And because I was on time, I ended up in a chair that was far from the door. And the first half hour or so of this meeting was just sort of stuff, agenda setting stuff, approving whatever. I have no memory of that part. And then something came up that was contentious. And if I could have gotten out of that room without climbing over 7 people, I absolutely would have.
Yeah.
But I was terrified that if I moved, everybody would look at me. So I stayed there while the friends in the meeting got mad at each other, and some of them yelled, and one person stormed out of the room and didn't come back. And I mean, I think I am very lucky that I didn't cry, because that level of anger at that time of my life, that tension could have brought me to that point. But the thing that mattered was that after like 2.5 hours, this went on for a really long time, the meeting ended, and two of the friends who had been in the deepest conflict, one of them turned around and they hugged each other. And seeing that, I thought, okay, there is something happening in this room. I hated that business meeting. It was not a good feeling. I don't suggest people let that happen in their meetings if they can possibly help it. But the fact that they hugged each other after it was over, that that really told me something.
Gosh. Let's go back to the first story you talked about, which was the first time somebody comes to a meeting and they're to be congratulated in the first place for finding out where the heck to go. And it's a completely silent meeting with 20 minutes of notices at the end with jargon. And, I know that that still happens time and time again, every week, all over this country, perhaps over your country as well. And smaller meetings and meetings with perhaps more older people who seem to quite like an hour of silence. Um, and how is alienating too strong a word? I don't know, maybe off-putting. Do some people come to experience that and never come back? I'm acutely aware of that. One of the practices that I have is that if I see somebody I don't recognize, I imagine being, in the experience of a first timer. And I see what's going on and I kind of try to look at it through their eyes. Um, and I'm often horrified, I'm often led to minister actually, even something very simple, just to kind of break that. Um, just absence, that it's almost, I don't know if it's an abyss, but it's a vacuum which for somebody who's been brave enough and tender enough to walk in the door, I just feel there needs to be a little bit of holding rather than just a throw in the deep end. Um, I don't know. Sometimes I always wonder to myself, am I doing the right thing? But I just, as I'm sitting there, it happens frequently for me. And I feel led to say something, even very briefly. How do you experience that nowadays when you have a silent meeting or when you have newcomers there?
Well, I think I want to say three different things about that. One is to tell you about my friend Bronwyn, who I always tell people about my friend Bronwyn when the question of welcoming comes up, because she has this inherent giftedness of being able to make a person feel appreciated in a space. That she can make it so that the new person feels seen and cared about, but she doesn't scare them. I would have been so easily frightened at that point in time. If somebody had tried to make a big deal out of me, I would have run away. But not everybody's like that. Some people desperately need attention. And so the person who's going to be the best at this welcoming is the person who has the inherent spiritual giftedness to see somebody for who they are and what they need in the moment. Bronwyn can do that. I think that there are other people who can do that. And to me, it is more important that we affirm the person with those gifts than it is that we set up a hospitality committee that has like a strategy by which to welcome newcomers. The second thing is the announcements. We need to make announcements. I'm done having the fight about, whether there should or shouldn't be announcements. There are going to be announcements. But I try really hard, and I encounter this all the time as a visitor too, because I travel from group to group constantly. So many times we don't explain the announcements. The vocabulary is incomprehensible or there's no context. And so I try really hard to practice translating. And the other trick that I use if I'm the person making announcements is I will always say, if someone has questions about this particular thing, who could they talk to? And
Mm.
I ask somebody in the room to raise their hand so that the person can say, oh, that guy with the glasses who's bald, that guy is the person I need to ask if I have a question about that. So giving people that contact. And then the last thing is having some sort of religious education or service or something built in. So there is a structured opportunity for additional interaction. Either there's a Sunday school, or there's a food kitchen where I can volunteer, or there's something so that my only way of getting to know people is not the social hour. For some people, social hour is perfect. It's wonderful. They love it. For other people, it is insurmountably difficult to initiate a conversation like that with a stranger. And the structure is essential.
We don't have structure, to be honest, in Britain. I mean, let's move into that then. Let's start with I mean, the reason I know of you is because I can see that you're very interested, or perhaps part of your ministry is traveling, and Britain is one of the places that I've seen your name all over things here. So I just wonder if you could tell us a bit, first of all, about why do I know your name here in Britain in Quakers? Because there's probably lots of Quakers in the US who I've never heard of. So why is it that you're here so much? What's your ministry? What's your the background to that?
Well, trying to think how I can make it not a story that lasts 20 minutes. I actually haven't been to Britain that many times. I think maybe 3 times. But one of the things that has happened is that each time I have been there, I have met a lot of people. And then because we live in the era in which we do, we can do a lot of overseas communications and a lot of passing along writings and that sort of thing. Uh, my first experience of a call to travel in ministry was a call to Britain Yearly Meeting. And I think that that might have happened in, I lose track, 2012, 2013, somewhere in there. And I went through an entire discernment process with my meeting about this call. I was still a comparatively inexperienced friend at the time. The idea of feeling a call to travel in ministry was both alien and very scary. It was not something in my that people in my meeting had done within living memory. And I didn't even know how to tell anybody that I was experiencing this call. I had said nothing about it for weeks and weeks, even months. And it took an elder of the meeting. Elder means something different here. It's a set of spiritual gifts. It's a spiritually perceptive person who nurtures other people's spiritual formation. That's the shorthand of what I mean when I say elder. And it took an elder in the meeting directly saying to me, is there something that you're not telling me? And that was the moment when I finally said, I've been experiencing this call to travel in the ministry in Britain Yearly Meeting. And I don't know what to do with that. My meeting set up a clearness committee. And then eventually we wrote a minute of travel. And that was approved by the local meeting and by the yearly meeting. And then we contacted Britain Yearly Meeting, and Britain Yearly Meeting had to figure out what to do with that because, again, we don't necessarily have systems in place.
Yeah.
But I was going to be in Britain for more than 3 months. So I applied for a visa, and the visa was denied. And when I got the message that the visa had been denied, what the message actually said was, for one thing, it said, we can see no logical purpose for this travel and therefore are not convinced that you actually intend to return to the United States. And I couldn't exactly argue with no logical purpose for this travel because there was no logical purpose for this travel. And then the second thing that this message said was, you cannot appeal this decision unless you can prove that your human rights have been violated according to the United Nations. That's a very high bar. And I did not attempt to appeal the decision. And I experienced what it felt like to be released, an internal feeling of saying, I don't have to do this after all.
Mhm.
All of this was really weird. The idea of being called to a thing, going through months of preparation, all these people did all this work, and then in the end, it didn't happen. And that was just befuddling. But what it did do, again, trying to make the story short, is it gave me practice in knowing how to navigate saying yes and taking chances and learning. It gave my meeting a chance to practice how we go through these steps. It gave the yearly meeting a chance to say, okay, this is a thing that is still a living tradition that we still affirm and we still do. And then the staff of Britain Yearly Meeting, at least, had heard of me, even though the travel didn't happen in the end. Over the next few years, I ended up doing a lot more smaller pieces of travel and ministry to other places. And I didn't actually end up in Britain until something more like 2017. And that was the first time that I came over. And by then, the circumstances were much different. I had a lot more experience. I knew what I was doing a lot more. I still didn't really know what I was doing, but it was definitely better than it had been. Um, and then by building relationships, I think that's why you've heard of me in Britain, because I've been there a few times. I've built the relationships, and I have been able to be in some places where I have been able to be useful.
Mm. Oh, that's so interesting because I really do feel that you have a part to play in our discernment, I think it's wonderful. And I think I was one of those people who responded to your call for some places that you might stay because I lived in the Quaker cottage at that time up in Yorkshire. And then suddenly it was all off and I didn't really know the background to that. So that was really interesting. But these things happen for a reason, don't they? And I yeah, it's fascinating. So we ended up talking about the structure then. You said you talked about religious education being an
Mhm.
important structure or something, some form of service or some form of activity that newcomers could get involved in. I mean, what's your impression of Britain? And I wonder if you can say how much have you seen? Have you thought about this in a British context? Do you have some impression of how we differ from the experiences you've seen at home?
So that's a really, really, really big question.
Mm,
I think part of the reason it's so big is because I'm immediately not just comparing how you differ from experiences at home, meaning like in New York, but thinking through comparisons to all of the different communities around the world that I have spent time with, including different branches and different cultures.
mm,
And then also when I think about Britain, I know that the meetings I have actually been to are all quite different from one another.
mm,
And so there's a piece of generalizing that's very hard to do. I think that there almost certainly are some meetings in Britain Yearly Meeting that would do things like a regular religious education structure, by which I might mean discussion for an hour once a month, or some kind of Bible study, or perhaps there are meetings in Britain that have a regular project where they help with the local food distribution pantry for the hungry or something like that. When I talk about needing a structure of some kind to plug into, what that opportunity is far less important than the fact that there is such an opportunity. And again, like I said, for some folks, this doesn't matter. For some people, the informal snacks and coffee is exactly what they need
mm,
as an entry point to the community. For others, they desperately need a chance to be in something where there are clear rules about what we're doing together and we're getting to know each other in that way. That's not a theological issue, that's a sociological principle, that is how some people learn to be part of a group. Is there some part of this you'd want me to say more about?
I suppose one of the things that occurs to me is that you've probably got much broader experience of the different types of branches, I think you called it, of Quakers. And in the UK, we really don't have any wider experience beyond what we've perhaps seen videos of, or maybe some of us have experienced it, but very small numbers. So, in terms of your access to, I think they're called conservative tradition, and programmed evangelical tradition, perhaps it's called, is it? And across the world as well. So, we don't have this cross fertilization happening. We don't have this enriching of each other's perspectives. So we're really quite um, monocultural in some way. And we have nothing, even though we're part of this huge worldwide family of friends, and we have all sorts of bodies like Friends World Consultation and things like that. And I know that there's a small percentage of friends in the UK who are involved. But it just feels to me that there's not much of that happening. There's not much looking across to other yearly meetings, other countries, and thinking, how can we try this? I've wanted to have more kind of exchanges of some kind, or twinning of meetings across boundaries, and really getting to know each other and learning from each other. And that there just seems to be so little appetite for that. But perhaps you as an individual have been able to do that. So I wonder if there's anything that you think we are missing out on, and do you think that would be of value to us?
Well, yes, absolutely. I think it would be of value to friends in Britain and not more so than in other places, but I think that is always true. When I think about early friends, the first one or two generations, and I think about their forming yearly meetings other than London yearly meeting in other places. I don't believe it was ever anyone's intention for these other yearly meetings to kind of become like separate and unique denominations of their own and to be doing everything internally within the context of the new yearly meeting. I think we had multiple yearly meetings for geographic reasons, because not everybody can be crossing the ocean every year to get to the yearly meeting gathering. So it makes sense to me that we did that. But we did it with the understanding that we would continue to have traveling ministers coming from London and going other places, and traveling ministers coming from other places and going to London. Traveling ministers were never perfect, and if it's useful, I can say a lot about the faults of that, but the original intention was that there would always be people going from group to group who were spreading inspiration, stories, theology, ideas, excitement, and
Mm.
that this would be something that would hold us together as a people. There isn't that central figure telling us what to do, so we were always meant to have this other thing of these people for whom it was the full-time occupation, or almost the full-time occupation, to
Mm.
be going from group to group and kind of carrying the living water. That was the intention. There are various reasons why we have a lot less of that now. And there are many things that can help us have those kinds of connections, like twinning of meetings, like meeting each other online, the big conferences that we might go to. And all of those things are amazing.
Mm.
And none of those things do what is one of the most important things that I experience as a traveling friend, which is overhearing the thing that is causing people pain as we're sitting around eating coffee cake together. It's the piece that nobody thought to explicitly mention, but is the real issue at the heart that people are really looking for help or connection about. And so it's very often that I will overhear something like that and I'll be able to say, guess what? There are some people in Ireland who have just solved that problem. Can I tell you their story? Can I put you in contact with them? It's that kind of informality
Mm.
that tends to make a really big difference.
So is there a way to build this again, do you think? Because it seems to me that this is a very practical solution, or at least partial solution, obviously, to so many of our issues, just precisely because of that mechanism that you've just described. And it feels to me like it's a lot of pressure to put on one or two of you,
Mm.
um, and a lot of pressure on the person talking to you then. Whereas if there was hundreds, or
Yes.
certainly dozens, then it would be just so enriching. And as you say, exciting, genuinely exciting, because people love people, you know? This is the thing. We love to hear each other's stories and connect. So is there a way, or do you think it's worth building? And what would we need to do realistically?
Well, there are lots of groups who are experimenting with this institutionally. The local development workers that are now functioning in most parts of Britain Yearly Meeting are an example of that. It's an institutional attempt to do something similar to what I'm describing. Not exactly the same thing, but
No.
similar.
No.
There's a group in New England Yearly Meeting that is accompanying local meetings and working in intervisitation and direct support for meetings that are looking for direct support. There are various missionary type models that are found in the evangelical yearly meetings that have some similarities to what I'm talking about. I think all of these are wonderful things. And actually, most of them I don't think we should let go of, but
Mm,
they're not quite the same as what a traveling minister is. And there are others, I'm not the only one. But the difference that I see is that I don't work for an institution. And that is enormously important.
mm,
I have accountability to my home meeting, 15th Street in New York City. And then I have accountability to God.
yeah.
And it's not just like me and God. That is a recipe for disaster, but I have accountability structures built in, people who meet with me regularly, hold me accountable, provide support, ask me questions, challenge me on things that I'm asserting. And because I don't work for an institution, I can work for everybody.
Mm,
I can work with everybody. I can go from the conservatives to the evangelicals to the Friends United Meeting Pastoral to Britain Yearly Meeting to Friends General Conference and carry things back and forth. I can design cross-institutional projects. I can write for all of these different audiences. And if I had institutional responsibilities to one particular group, I couldn't do that in the same way that I can.
yeah.
But of course, the thing about this that is really, really hard is that there's not a financial structure in place for somebody like me. I
No.
still have to eat. I still have to have a minimum level of human comforts. I keep it as low as I can. The house that I'm in right now is not mine. I don't own a house. I don't rent an apartment. I don't have a place to live. I'm on the road full time. My costs are really, really low. And it's the most amazing thing I've ever done in my life. And I never would have even hoped for something like this. I love what I get to do. And I am donor supported. There's an organization called Good News Associates that supports non-institutional ministry, and that's my legal employer. And they're fantastic. But this is not easy. It's
Mm,
not easy. And so having more models and talking about this more, about what this is, raising up actual ministry as opposed to having only staff positions, I think that's the difference that I see. And that's a set of skills that has been lost in a lot of our meetings.
that's just so interesting because I mean I've just been speaking to someone else about, the numbers of staff that we have. And, you end up with organizational issues and managerial issues, and people get, you know, in all walks of life, in all professional circumstances, people get jaded, and there's no, you know, these are our friends, we wish them well, but is it possible to be working in these roles for your entire life? And what is the problems of institutionalization? And therefore you're just working as a body to, to survive, if you like, to maintain and perpetuate your organization. and that the priorities get a little bit strange. So I'm a little bit I'm a bit negative about that at the moment in terms of I do wonder whether we need to consider having fewer permanent paid staff and more something different. And I don't know what that is, but since we're talking now, I'm just thinking, well, maybe it's more of a temporary um, type role. Like, I mean, do you consider your role to be a temporary thing for a certain part of your life, or do you see it as lifelong, or do you not know yet?
I don't know because my job is to be responsive to the leadings of the Holy Spirit. That's my job. And I have no idea if I will do this forever or not. I do very much hope to be old someday. And at that point, I certainly won't be able to function physically in the
Mm.
same way that I do now.
It's challenging.
But aside from that, I just don't know. What you're talking about in terms of paid staff I think there are situations in which large groups of paid staff do go awry and bad things happen. And I think that can also be said of complicated committee structures and systems of people who are in nominated positions, who are volunteering, if you will. That's not quite the right word, but
Yeah.
people who are operating within an institutional committee system, because the systems do tend to drift toward perpetuation of the system.
Yeah.
Uh, and that is a natural thing, and that is not a human being's fault. This
No.
is not that people are doing something wrong. I know examples, and I'm not gonna like try to name the good and the bad, but I know examples of people who are in full-time institutional staff positions who are absolutely doing deep, vital ministry and are primarily concerned for the welfare, the spiritual and physical welfare of the people that they serve, and are not centered in institutional preservation, but it is a thing that they're aware of
Yeah.
as being something that can cause drift. And they are actively paying attention to it and actively refocusing their priorities. And they are fighting what is a natural tendency of institutions. But
Yeah.
again, I don't think that that is necessarily because we're paying staff. I think that that has more to do with if we are not being thoughtful about how the institution is or is not fulfilling what we're called to do together at this time.
Mm.
Are we or are we not paying attention to the authentic spiritual gifts of the people who are doing service, paid or not? In other words, are we putting someone in a position because we need somebody in that position?
Mm.
Or are they in that position because they're called to do that work?
Yeah. Yeah. And I have no problem with paying staff. I mean, I really think staff should be paid. So that's not my issue at all. I think it's the permanence of it and the, as you say, the drift and the way in which it's just the way people are. And you get comfy and you get cozy and before you know it, you're just doing the same thing every day. And one of the things in doing these videos, I took an editorial decision early on that I only wanted to speak to people who were really willing to spend the first half an hour talking to me about their religious formation and their who they are, you know. And it's been really interesting to me. I have no way of knowing who's going to say yes and who's going to say no. But some people have been very clear, no, I don't feel I can talk about that. Now, it could just be a public thing, and I get that. And that's not to say that they're not doing this work. But there's something about not just the once off of bringing people into roles, but it's a regular thing of connecting into the mystical experiences and the prophetic experiences of what people are called to do. And that doesn't really, how can that happen in in a large institution with, dozens and dozens or if not hundreds of staff? How can it's just going to become like any other organization so quickly, isn't it?
No, I don't have no hope for that kind of situation. But I do know that it takes really dedicated attention, and also training. Again, I'm going to go back to that US definition of elders, of people who are really good at the spiritual formation of other people and deeply insightful and supportive and know how to help people grow. We desperately need that kind of elder to be teaching us how to do things like recognizing gifts and developing people and understanding what a calling is and how we discern that. Because again, it's not that God has stopped doing these things in our communities. I really don't believe that.
Mhm.
But these are not things we inherently automatically know how to do. It takes practice and training, and somebody has to explain these ideas and work with us as we do it very messily and make a lot of mistakes. And so I do believe it's possible. I just don't believe that a lot of us are managing to do it right at this moment.
No. And the other tendency, I think, as humans is to separate out into silos where we all kind of go over here where we agree with everyone. I know the States is a bit different because you do have these different traditions, which from the way that I look at it, there must be some kind of broadly political differences between people, I would have thought. And I don't really want to get into American politics. I don't know much about it. But having said that, we're about to see Trump inaugurated in a couple of weeks' time. And one of the challenges it feels to me is that as we go through, political and social changes, is that there's a danger, and I think the danger is happening in Britain, that we have become this progressive politics charity. And it really worries me. I mean, that is the driving concern that I have, perhaps. If I had to say, what is the thing that worries me, that's caused me to have all of these conversations, is because I feel like we've stopped prioritizing that deep, life-giving encounter. And we've started to disconnect that from what we're then called to do in the world. And all the messaging and all of the activism that we do, I sometimes struggle to see that it's connected to that mystical encounter in the first place.
Mm.
And that there's a lot of noise, shall we say. And it's all the same as all the other progressive politics that's happening in the UK. And if we had an evangelical tradition in the UK, I suspect it would be on the other side and doing, saying different things. So I just wondered, does any of that mirror your experience in the States? Do you
Yeah.
see that kind of, we call it silos over here, this kind of moving into groups where everyone agrees with each other and then you've got this echo chamber. Do you have that same issue?
Yes. Uh, I'm going to say something else first, really briefly. When I go to Kenya, the Kenyans, all of them, not just the Friends, all Kenyans, talk about God way more than I feel comfortable. Like every other sentence that comes out of their mouth is a sentence about God. When I am talking with British friends, or sometimes with some groups of friends in the States, I talk about God way more than is comfortable for them.
Hmm.
And sometimes I do it on purpose as a way to remind us that this actually is a faith group. And that has been historically at our core. Incidentally, if somebody wants to use a word other than God, that's fine with me,
Hmm.
but that's my word and I need it. A lot of the splits in the States, I'm not a historian, so I can't promise you I'm right about this, but a lot of what I see is that splits that appear to be political or theological in nature tend to happen actually on the rural-urban divide.
Okay.
And so what I think it really is, at least in part, is cultural drift apart from one another and really not actually knowing how to talk to each other very well. And the people who live in the rural areas mostly talk to other people who live in rural areas, and the people who live in cities mostly talk to other people who live in cities. And over time, any group of people that only talks to itself will experience ideological drift further
Mm.
to the extreme. Again, that's a sociological phenomenon. We know that that's true.
Yeah.
There is something really, really hard about saying, I am going to make a deliberate effort to be in regular contact with people who have beliefs that make me deeply uncomfortable.
Hmm.
Gosh, that's a hard thing to do. It's even harder to do if you're not in the habit of doing it.
Mm.
And as you get in the habit of doing it, it does become easier to not be in conversation across serious ideological divides, honest listening conversation that is like mutually vulnerable. To not do that, I don't remember where this quote comes from because I've been reading books of discipline from all over the world recently, but somebody says to refuse to engage with the person who is different from us is to refuse to influence history. And that feels really important to me. There is an issue of sometimes it just hurts more than is reasonable for me to talk to these other people. And you know what? Sometimes it does. Sometimes for some people, there are some other groups of people for whom it is too much to ask for you to talk to that person. And I don't believe anybody should ever have to do the thing that hurts the most or is the scariest.
Yeah.
And I'm not prepared to make broad statements about this group doesn't have to talk to that group because there's a lot of individual variation. And all of us need to do the thing that is a little bit scary. If we don't, all we do is continue to be in small groups talking to small groups, and there is that ideological drift that keeps happening, and we end up with less and less peace rather than more and more, and not very much hope for change.
Mm.
Refusing to talk to somebody is not a good way for them or you to change.
I'm sure those words would be very closely read and heard by friends in Britain. I think there's a lot of wisdom in there. It's making me think about Friends' houses, London, and I mean I'm in Wales and I used to be in Yorkshire. So even though they are not um, completely rural or isolated, they're still urban in their own way. I can see what you mean that that is quite a useful way to make that distinction, actually. Um, but yeah, thank you for that. That's so. Do you do that yourself? I mean, in your traveling ministry, do you go places which are uncomfortable?
Yes, all the time. One of the reasons I do it all the time is because if I stop for a couple of months, it's much harder to do it again, much harder, because you start to sort of build up that wanting to protect yourself, or at least I do. Maybe I shouldn't speak for other people, but that is my experience. So I very intentionally go into things like a sporting event that I've never done before, not to play, but to watch and to talk to the other people in the stands. Or I will go to a Bible study where I know that the theological approach is going to be radically different from anything that I'm comfortable with. Or I will worship with other traditions, like I'll go to a synagogue or something, and then stay after and have conversations over the bagels that we're eating together.
Yeah.
Um, I don't do this with an agenda to change the people I'm talking to, because I think if we go in with that specific agenda, then not only is that kind of a disingenuous thing, but it doesn't work. It's a matter of going and saying, I actually want to know you. I really and truly want to hear how your life is and what things are like. And then if you want to hear from me, I'll talk too. But I
Mm.
am coming in because I legitimately want to know you.
Mm.
And so, yes, I do that all the time. And sometimes it is very hard. but most of the time, it is extraordinarily rewarding.
Yeah, yeah. And when you go out into different groups, there's always the potential that you might be changed. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? It's not to change them, but you go in and you might come out slightly different. I did this kind of a thing like that myself about 10 years ago, where I went round a variety of different churches. Um, and that was just fascinating. And you very quickly pick up of things that horrify you, as well as things that, you kind of admire. So it's so interesting. And I just wonder in the UK, you see, I just wonder I don't know how much diversity there is. And what's that phrase? Something about, people arguing over very, very small differences. Is it the bigotry of small difference or something? And I just feel we're such a monoculture with this much between us all, but we fight over those differences instead of going out and mixing with, as you say, Kenyan friends or evangelical friends or whatever it might be, in quantity and in volume mixing. We don't do that, but we just argue with each other over these tiny, tiny little differences.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
yeah, it's interesting.
again, that's natural.
Mm,
If you're in a group of people with a limited range of ideological differences, we will experience tension over what ideological differences there actually are. If we put ourselves in a community where the range of ideas is much wider, then the tension in this part of the spectrum will not feel
yeah,
as drastic. But to me, actually, the reason to do it isn't that. To me, the reason to do it is if we are actually looking for peace in the world and we are trying to ask, how are we led to create peace and justice in the world? I don't think that this part of the spectrum is able to find the answers for the entire part of this, for the whole world. I really believe that if we believe in corporate discernment as a principle, if we think it actually is a thing that a community of people can be led collectively, we have to do it in this context. If our question is, how do we build peace on earth? Because this group of people can only find it for this group of people. So to me, that's the bigger reason
yeah,
to be
yeah,
stepping outside the circles.
yeah. And of course, that is a call for diversity, if you like. But what and we get that a lot in Britain Early Meeting. But you see, I'm very critical of that because I think it's a very narrow form of diversity that we're calling for. I hear people talking about, diversity in terms of sexuality, for example, so more gay and trans people, fine. We talk about diversity in terms of ethnic background, fine. But that's such a limited way of looking at diversity. So, I mean, a friend of mine joked about it last week, and he said, really what they're talking about is Guardian readers, different types of Guardian readers. I don't know, sorry if you don't know
So
the
I think I
newspaper,
got it.
The
Yeah.
Guardian in the
Yep.
UK is very left-wing progressive politics. And my friend said to me, they're just looking at diversity in terms of different types of different ethnic minorities. As long as you're a Guardian reader, as long as you're that kind of progressive politics person, but across the range of British politics, if you like, and social groups, I just don't see any wish to include a great variety. And again, as you say, that's perhaps natural. Um, would you advocate us trying to broaden the theological differences amongst, I mean, even if that's possible, but um, I suppose wondering what we can learn from the States in that you have different traditions. Do they try to broaden each other's experiences by doing things together?
I mean, sort of, and sometimes. And when we are at our best, I think we do. Uh, I think my answer to your question is a yes and, or a yes or a yes both. Because I know when I am, so different types of diversity. When I am in a place like Palestine or Nairobi, or when I am in a Pentecostal Bible study, or when I am uh, at a church, like I visited a Mennonite church that is Indonesian a couple of months ago, and I worshiped in that Mennonite church that was primarily in the Indonesian language. When I am in a community like that, I do experience broadening and inspiration, and it's really hard. It's so hard. Every second of it is like an added difficulty level because I am constantly trying to adjust to the cultural differences, the linguistic differences, the language differences. I don't think it's reasonable to ask anybody to try to do that every day of their life or all the time, or necessarily in their own local faith community where they need to be able to be the most vulnerable and open that you can possibly be. So, do we have to have that level of cultural and ideological difference in our little core local faith communities? Maybe not. Maybe that's asking too much. Maybe sometimes we need some element of comfort and safety,
Mm-hmm.
but not all the time.
Yeah,
You don't grow if you are constantly terrified, but you don't grow if you are constantly safe and comfortable either.
yeah, yeah.
Neither of those things works. So, what is the sometimes that you can be engaging or we can be engaging across the wider differences? Maybe it's not, and this is a maybe, I don't know. Maybe it's not that Britain Yearly Meeting becomes this more broadly theologically inclusive umbrella, but maybe it's that more of the local meetings say, we are going to have a once a month gathering with some faith tradition in our community that tends to have very different ideas than we do, very different. And we're going to build a relationship with them. And over time, maybe together, our two communities are going to do something about hunger in the community, and we're going to work on something that matters to both of us. That to me is the additional stretch opportunity that we've got to be in contact with other people and we have to be working on things we can do together in good conscience. But we don't necessarily have to be in worship together every single Sunday.
No, no. And I think that's great. And it also makes me think about what that means is if we are going to challenge ourselves sometimes to be going out, I think we also have to be less critical of ourselves when there's always these complaints, oh, we're so white and we're so educated and we're so this and that. And I think, well, let's not knock that, you know. That is who we are. Let's kind of be gentle about that. Well, that is the tradition, you know. You have to be quite robust to be able to come into a meeting, like you said at the very beginning, to walk into a room in ordinary clothes and sit down and wait for an hour. That's you've got to be quite robust actually and confident to do that. So it draws a certain type of people together. Um, so I do wonder whether we need to kind of give ourselves a bit of a break that we are who we are, but then have the confidence and the courage to go out a little bit more. Um,
In my experience, it is about the going out piece of it.
mm,
Um, I can look around at my community and say, too many of us have graduate degrees, and I feel like that's representing a lack of diversity, and I don't think that's good for me. But my experience, my own human experience has been that trying to make ourselves be a community of more people who don't have graduate degrees, actually, historically, I haven't seen that work very often.
mm,
And so if I'm concerned about I'm only getting one point of view, my way of solving that problem is to act like I actually want to experience other points of view, which means going to the places that are comfortable for the people who have that point of view and doing it humbly and recognizing that I am walking into someone else's thing and I am a guest, and that's how I'm going to be present there.
yeah. Yeah, that's great. That's great. So, can I ask you to finish off then by, from your perspective, do you have any hopes or fears for the future of Quakers in Britain? I know that's very difficult because you're not part of our yearly meeting, but as an observer, any hopes or fears?
When I, one of the times that I came over to Britain for a few months was shortly after the Brexit vote.
Mm,
And it was an interesting experience because I went to all of these places, like Quaker schools and Quaker meetings and Quaker institutions. And I didn't meet a single person the whole time who had voted for Brexit. Or if I did, they didn't tell me. Like they weren't going to say that.
mhm,
And then I ended up in the south of England spending one night in a bed and breakfast. And the guy who owned that had survived World War II. He had lived in London as a child and been an evacuee and had experienced being bombed repeatedly. And we were sitting at the table together. And he started talking to me about how he knew from his own human experience that you cannot trust the international cooperation and that you have to be able to stand on your own 2 feet. And if Britain couldn't stand on its own 2 feet, it wasn't safe. And for the sake of future generations, he voted for Brexit. I hadn't heard anybody else say that.
mhm,
And so I guess my hope is for friends in Britain to find a way to know that guy.
mhm. Amen. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Emily. I think that's a great place to finish. Thank you so much for your time today and all your wisdom.
Good to talk to you.
Go well in your travels.
Thank you. You too.